Support for Lab Out Loud is provided by NSTA, the National Science Teaching Association. Find out more about what NSTA has to offer at nsta.org. You're listening to Lab Out Loud, Science for the Classroom and beyond. And today our guest is here to help us answer the question, why study ants?
Well, A, they're cool. And so I think we have a lot to learn from them. They don't have really big brains. They follow simple rules. But using these simple rules with some level of fidelity, they actually get along and are able to create very complex tasks to work together. Also, ants are essential for ecosystem services. They cycle the soil, turning it over. If we didn't have ants, things would be fundamentally different, probably not necessarily in a good way.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud. But first, I'm your co-host, Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.
Well, it's that time of year. We're getting into the summer season. You might be planning some time on your patio, outside, going camping.
Just getting the yard ready.
Getting the yard ready, a little picnicking. And of course, with all those activities, there's a lot of fun, a lot of interaction with your friends and family. But sometimes you might have some interactions with some unwanted guests. And of course, we're talking about ants.
Not aunts. Although they may be unwelcome depending on what you're doing, but
that's right. And I think the thing that freaks me out about ants is when you see them, it's not just one ant. Like flies. Oh no, there's a fly. But a lot of flies, that's like, oh God.
Have you been walking down the sidewalk and you see there is thousands upon thousands of ants just like all over each other?
Yes, I hate it when you're like, let's say, have you ever been in this scenario where you have like a picnic or you're doing something outside and you're like, oh, there's an ant. And then all of a sudden you like look farther, you widen your field of view and they're like, oh my God, they're everywhere.
It's not just one.
Yes, that's what freaks me out about ants because they're so darn industrious. They're colonies. And, it seems like they don't come...
They work together well or something.
Yeah, I have a natural, then, I guess, desire to be like, get rid of all the ants. We don't want ants. And that's why today's guest, I guess, is very enlightening for me because I think it's important to look at those pests that you may want to get rid of and push out of your life and take a second look and understand what the benefits are.
So that's why it's important for us to remember that there's a balance in the ecosystem, and things that annoy us might be someone else's little area of study, and in doing so, their research might find things that benefit us in other ways that we can't even imagine.
That brings us to Scientists Out Loud, which is a thread that we've been doing on our podcast every so often where we contact a scientist that is studying a particular area, and our area for this week's episode is ants.
I'm Terry McGlynn, professor of biology at Cal State Dominguez Hills. I work on ants, mostly in tropical rainforests. I teach undergraduates about science once in a while.
Huh. Have you seen that ants? I think it's a Geico commercial where we got a new house. We love it, but we have ants.
I have not seen that one.
Oh, it's so great. And the ants are all like their ants. So there's these old ladies and they're like, oh, it's a nice house. Hope you can keep it clean. Sorry. I just absolutely love that commercial.
It's like the ones with we have a fencing problem with our neighbors.
Yeah, we have a rat problem and it's the rat band playing, or we have a clog problem. We have clogs and it's people clogging.
But you're talking about real ants here.
You're talking about real ants.
Like not aunts, as some people say.
Not the judgmental relatives that are my sister or my mother's and father's sisters.
Correct. Yes.
All right. So what?
Although we talk a lot about
ants?
relatedness, we talk about ants though,
because
when people ask, well, how are ants so social? Then a lot of the explanation is because they're so closely related to one another. Then that's a lot of good reason for them to cooperate. So when people talk about how organisms, live to reproduce, that the way natural selection works is you favor your own offspring. And so because ant colonies have ants that are so closely related to one another, then it makes sense to help one another out.
Well, how closely related? Like, if it was in human terms, what are they, all cousins or?
Well, in the simplest ant colony, all the ants are sisters, and they have the same mother.
Wow, that's right.
But some of them also will have the same father, which is no surprise, because the queen stores the sperm from a male that she have mated with. But what's really weird and super cool is that the males are haploid, meaning they only have a single copy of their genes, rather than a lot of other animals we think of have two copies of their genes, which means that males produce sperm which are all identical to one another, which means that the sisters in an ant colony with the same father are 75% related to one another.
Whoa. Wow.
Which is, we could only be related 50% to one another unless you're identical twins or something like that. Because you'd have your genes from your mom, have your genes from your dad. But in this case, when they get their genes from the dad, they're all shared because all the sperm from the dad are identical.
That just throws in a whole different... I think there should be some kind of children's book explaining this. And it'd be like Aunt Annie the Ant or something like that. And, you know... It's a genealogical kind of exploration, kids.
Yeah.
So how does one become someone who studies ants? Like, how does that history get you to there? Yeah.
The way I became an Myremocologist, which we call who study ants, is you know, I mean, this is a straightforward approach is where you're into it. You go to college. After you go to college, you go to grad school, and then you do research on that topic. I didn't start actually getting into it right when I was graduating college. I knew late on, shortly before I graduated, I had this epiphany where I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to study ecology and evolution. And I just happened to start reading a bunch of work from this one particular person. Because I was interviewing to go to his lab for grad school. And I was like, wow, look at that. That's cool. Like, ants are really interesting. I think I want to study that. But it's not like I was one of those kids who started studying ants as a kid and had his own insect collection or whatever. I just thought that they were an interesting model system. So now I love ants. I think ants are super cool, but it's not as if I've always been that way.
So now when you see ants in your house, how do you react to that? Because that is something that I want to say almost terrifies me. I don't want to say terrifies. Terrifies is a hard word, but, you know, I don't like ants in my house. How's that?
Well, I don't want them in my house either. And so, you know, the E.O. Wilson, the super duper most famous person that most people can name, people ask him, what should I do with ants in my house? And he says, well, you should get out a magnifying glass and watch them. They're really interesting. Ha ha ha. Like, that's not really how I feel. So I usually get the caulking gun and find out how they came in and seal that off. And it's like a evolutionary arms race where I try to block off where they come in and then they find another way and I block that one off.
It is.
I was about to say, trying to cock up all their entry points, that's got to be a losing battle, right?
Well, yeah, because my house is like 100 years old, so that's a little harder. But usually it's in the kitchen.
Isn't it more to do with trying to prevent like a source of them or they want to come in?
Well, yeah. I mean, if they find... Once they think that there's something there, if there's one night where I don't clean out the sink well enough, then they'll find something in the trap, and then they'll keep trying for weeks. And so clearly you want to prevent that. But still, even when there's weather changes, when it gets really hot or really cold quickly, then what happens is then the ants are more likely to move inside, just for temperature alone, at least in Southern California, Northern California.
So let's say there's a podcaster who pays someone to kill all the ants at his house.
Hypothetically,
I'm asking for a friend. Should I be worried about that?
No. I mean, other than if it meets your needs, that's fine. But I think they might not necessarily be meeting your interest in the long run, just because most of the ants that come inside our house are coming from colonies that have a huge number of queens. And so if they knock back the ants that you have, then they'll just come back a month later, often. Okay. And so you can use toxic baits, and these toxic baits, they'll bring it back and they'll kill them off. But still, it's a war of attrition. So they're often be coming from outside, depending on the kind of ants that you have.
Yeah, my neighbor is wont to say, Well, we live around trees, so you're going to have ants. Is that pretty safe to say?
No. Well, it depends on the ants that you have. In Wisconsin,
Little dinky black ones.
Are they odorous house ant? Do they have like a strongest blue cheesy smell to them?
No.
I've never smelled them. We've had carpenter ants before, so that's part of that. I know that.
Oh, that's something else, and they're just living inside your house, and then
I had these little black ones. All over the place.
So that could be the odorous house ant. Could be those little black ones. See, here the little black ones are Argentine ants, but they wouldn't be in Wisconsin because it's too cold for them. So usually the most likely candidate would be the quote odorous house ant.
The odorous house ant.
Yeah, and so that's a common name. And you get actually they have this blue cheesy odor to them that they do, so you can tell if you actually give them.
I've never smelled an ant, but I'm curious. So are we going to see all the ants that are in our house, or are they kind of keep to themselves, or they keep out of the sight?
Well, I suppose if you have carpenter ants that are like living in your framework, then they probably don't want to, then you most likely see them at night once in a while, but otherwise they would be incognito. But otherwise, you would see the ants that are living in your house. I mean, because they're probably accessing the food or water that you're using otherwise. It's not like there's some other insects that are hiding out and and they're hard to see.
Right. Yeah, we had some siding replaced and there was some water damage underneath it. So that was most likely the source of it. So we haven't really had anything significant since, but we have trees around us too. So I know that what you're telling me is
the ones that live in the trees probably aren't the ones that are frequenting your house as pests. Okay.
Well, good to know. I feel like we should be paying you a consulting fee right now, but I'm asking these because a lot of times we get interested in science because of what we see around us. So what other things can we take from ants that we see around us?
Yeah. So I have to admit that I think the ants that we have up in North America, especially when you get in higher latitudes, just really aren't that interesting to me because I work in rainforests and ants are like everywhere. And so people say, why do you study ants? And then they show up in the rainforest, like my students who work with me, they're like, oh, this is why you study ants, because there's everywhere and they're cool and they're every single kind of possible biological process they could do, you see happening. Whereas here you see ants, oh, here's a mound, here's a hole in the ground, they do a couple things. I mean, don't get me wrong, ants are super cool.
Yeah.
And so you can watch ants, you could look at their foraging behavior, and you can look at social behavior. There's a whole bunch of people who keep ants as pests. They're amateur myrmecologists, and I say amateur in the best way possible, as out of the love of ants. I do it for a living, but they actually do it out of a passion. And people
like the ant farm kind of a... But a little bit more than the standard ant farm you might get.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you order an ant from Uncle Milton, those ants are destined to die because they don't send you a queen, and they just work for a few weeks and they're done. And but if you can build your own formicarium, or you can get your own ants, and you can collect a whole colony, and you can keep them for years.
You're really increasing our vocabulary.
Yeah. So I got myrmecology or myrmecologist.
Mm-hmm.
What was the other one?
Formicarium, which is just like his formico is just the prefix for
instead
ants,
of aquarium, formicarium.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, all right.
Like a terrarium.
What other ant vocabulary should we know about?
Oh gosh. So entomology, obviously.
Yeah, sure.
In myrmecology. Sure. And so, here's another fancy word. So sometimes you see ants. Smelling ants, like you said, I've never smelled ants before, right? And so there are two kinds of ants that often look really similar to one another, and the only way you can tell them apart is by their smell. And so you'll see some myrmecologists like smelling ants, or they're grabbing them and smelling them, and they're trying to say, is it in this group or is it in that group? And those ants that have that blue cheesy smell are in the subfamily Dolichodorini, for example. So
this is really not good in the coronavirus times if you lose your sense of smell.
Yeah,
that's true.
Are they wafting, kind of just wafting some ant towards them?
Well, I mean, you really smell this. Yes, they do waft. They really use the smells for communication with other ants, where they lay their trail pheromones and all other kinds of communication. And so ants are visually oriented to some extent, but the way they often communicate with one another is chemicals. And so they're just bagged chemicals. And so ants, we are still discovering new glands inside ants, oddly enough. And so, but there's a few glands that all ants have, and they produce them for communication.
So you're talking to us about our ants are kind of boring here in the Midwest and northern latitudes, but what are some intriguing ant things that you've learned about or discovered in the Amazon ants that you've been investigating?
That's what I was thinking. Like, what you know, our student questions are going to be like, what's the biggest ant? What's the smallest ant? You know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well,
if they have a smell, do they taste funny?
Right. So one of the ants that I work with is called the giant tropical ant, which a lot of people call the bullet ant, Paraponera clavata, and it is one of the biggest ants. There are the ant which looks very similar to it, which is slightly larger. They're very, very gentle. But the bullet ants, as the name would suggest, have an extraordinarily painful sting.
They were in Ant-Man.
I discovered how painful this hurts when it stings you, just by my own mistake.
Stung by them?
Once in the lab, and I used and I was showing a student how to do a project for the first time in the lab, and I was trying to show her how to be comfortable with them, handle them appropriately, and I guess I just got so comfortable that I wasn't looking, and it got me on the finger, and then I just terrified her, and she just seeing my screaming and the language, and she probably wasn't too comfortable working with them for the next week.
So I thought ants bite. Do they bite?
Yeah, all ants in theoretically can bite. Some ants have a stinger that has venom in it. And so some ants, instead of having a stinger, they have a pore in the back end, an acidopore, and they use that to spray acid, like formic acid.
Jeez.
And so it's called formic acid because formicity or ants. And so some ants will bite you, and then they'll spray the acid in the wound, which is what stings. That's more of a temporary sting. Whereas the venom, on the other hand, they inject it inside you, like a honeybee would, for example. And so then that actually makes it hurt a lot longer because it goes because actually venom underneath your skin. And with the bullet ant, the stinger is so long, it could be intramuscular.
Ooh, really?
So the pain lasts 24 hours sometimes. It's really bad.
I looked this up on Wikipedia. The bullet ant's sting is currently the highest on the Schmidt's Sting Pain Index. You can just picture the hospital, where are you on the, where's your pain level? And they have different ants.
Oh, it's a 4.
According to entomologist Justin O. Schmidt, he describes the pain like, quote, walking over flaming charcoal with 3 inches of nails embedded in your heel. That bad?
Yeah. The way I describe it is, imagine you put your finger, because I got stung on the finger, you put your finger on a countertop and you hand someone a hammer and you ask them to hit your finger with that hammer as hard as they can.
Oh.
Or maybe a sledgehammer.
It felt finger, all nerves there too.
Yeah, exactly.
It says waves of burning, throbbing, all-consuming pain that continues unabated for up to 24 hours. Sounds lovely.
Yeah.
So this is our own little version of that podcast.
And then it just went numb.
What was that?
Mine went about 8 hours. Oh, sorry. You go ahead.
No, I was just thinking about that YouTuber who basically gets stung by everything. This would be right up his alley.
Oh, good Lord.
I don't even know what these kids are watching, but that's the guy who, what is it? Guy who gets stung.
Oh, yeah.
Guy who gets stung by things. I can actually search it for that.
So
Brave Wilderness.
So Terry, your pain lasted for
about 8 hours, and then I lost muscle soreness in the hand. I couldn't even hold a coffee cup in the hand, and then it just went numb. And the next morning, it was fine.
But it was steady.
Yeah, it was a steady throbbing pain for several hours, enough where I couldn't focus on any kind of work or anything.
Did you just roll around, or can you take anything?
I mean, I screamed for several minutes, and I was mad at myself, but it really, really, really hurt.
Wow. So is there a revenge here when you get stung by an ant like this? Do they die after that, or is it not the way that works in the ant world?
No, so honeybees, they die when they sting you because they have a little barb in their stinger. And then when they sting you, the venom sac goes with it. And when it flies away, it leaves the venom sac there and it continues to pump for a couple minutes to empty. But that's a really unique thing. There's one kind of wasp that has a barb sting, but almost all other stinging social insects, they can sting you multiple times. I mean, once they sting you several times, and they're probably out of venom, so it doesn't matter. But yeah, they should be fine after stinging you.
All right, so we got the biggest ant, our near biggest ant, and it packs a heck of a wallop for a sting. What else you got? I guess, give us the biggest, the boldest, the brightest, the.
Ants with really big colonies that are in tropical forests are army ants. And so these ants, a lot of people don't realize, are predators of other ants. So there are a few army ants that will just eat everything that you find on the ground, all other kinds of bugs and whatever they can grab. But most army ants are specialized predators on other ants, where they just raid other ant colonies and take away their babies.
Are ants mostly carnivorous that way?
Ants in general have all different kinds of diets. So some essentially are functionally herbivorous, and some ants farm fungus actually. And then some ants are just generalized predators. They grab what they can, or they'll get nectar from plants. And then there are some like army ants, which are top level predators.
I was reading something recently about ants in the Soviet Union that have fallen into a bunker from like a Soviet era, like a missile bunker, and they have no food down there, so they cannibalize each other, and they just wait for other ants to fall down.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
And they can,
we're steering towards
fell
the
down and they just sort of stayed down there.
Yeah. There's no way to get them out. There's actually someone who tried to rescue them by putting like a big long pole for them to climb out of, but no avail. So, all right. So why should we care about ants? I guess that, kind of talking about some of the most extreme ants here that you've seen, and we invite other stories of crazy ants pieces here, but why should we care about ants?
Well, they're cool. And so I think we have a lot to learn from them. The way that they organize behaviors, they don't have really big brains. They follow simple rules, but using these simple rules with some level of fidelity, they actually get along and are able to create very complex tasks and to work together. And so I think there's something to be learned about for our own society. That's not to say that ants are paragons of virtue, because there is conflict within ant colonies. And
there was a cannibalism.
Right. There is the cannibalism. There are arguably wars or such between colonies. But they're, what's the best way of saying this? But the ant colonies, because they are able, following certain social rules, can create conditions that help the whole succeed. So I don't know if that's a lesson in socialism or whatnot. But for instance, a lot of people are using studies of animal behavior and how ants divide tasks to create robots that can to assemble structures. Like, imagine if you're trying to build a habitat on Mars. Probably the easiest way to build a habitat, instead of building a massive crane down there, instead is to spend a very large number of very small robots that can behave like ants. And people are working on stuff like this. Like, people have contracts from the military to, come up with these kinds of plans and ideas. Also, ants are essential for ecosystem services. They cycle the soil, turning it over. If we didn't have ants, things would be fundamentally different, probably not necessarily in a good way. But I just think, why would we care about capybaras? Why do we care about, pretty trees? It's like, they're just super cool, and they're a part of biodiversity. But they're also an essential part of ecosystem services too.
When they follow their simple rules, does what they can accomplish
change by the size of the colony? So like if the colony doubles, do they get like, twice as many abilities, I guess, or expand into what they can accomplish?
So if you're comparing the same colony as it grows, then it does things differently, but it's not as if its behavioral repertoire is greater. I think just by having larger numbers, then you might be able to have more specialization, or you might be able to be buffered from environmental change. If something bad happens, then you can respond to it more effectively.
Oh, okay.
I would argue in many ways a colony of like 10 or 20 ants, and there's some species that have colonies with just a few ants in them, arguably has many behaviors or same level of individual behavioral complexity as a colony of leafcutter ants that has like 100,000 ants, for example.
I didn't realize that. Yeah, I think of colonies like it was millions of ants or something like that, but you can have small colonies.
Yeah, most of the ants that I work with are actually these really teensy tiny ones that nest in the leaf litter on the floor of the rainforest. And some colonies are just a few individuals. Some might be a couple dozen, and they fit in a tiny little microcentrifuge tube. I mean, they're just incredible. And these ants are so tiny.
Wow.
Oh, wow. How do you find them in the Amazon then if they're that tiny? And there's such biodiversity there that how do you distinguish them from one species to the next?
T-shirts.
Very carefully. So there are some
smelling them is what I'm remembering from the beginning of the conversation, right?
Begin wafting.
Right. Actually when you break open a twig, you have a distinct smell and you're like, oh, I know it's one of these few kinds of ants because based on its smell, that's true. And so ultimately to work with these twig nesting ants, you break open a lot of twigs and you look really carefully and like, oh, look, there's the colony. There's other ways of sampling them where you could grab the litter and then you sift it and then you hang it in the sack and you let the ants wiggle their way out and then you collect them. To identify these ants, almost all the time, you just need a microscope and you need to know what to look for.
So as a myrmecologist, is it just ants every day? That's what you're studying? Or do you find yourself needing to study, like you mentioned fungus before, do you have to learn a lot about the other things that the ants are interacting with?
Yeah. So I'd say the kind of work that I do is I'm an experimental natural historian. So someone said, oh, that's the kind of work that you do, experimental natural history. And I'm like, oh, I like that. Actually, that makes a lot of sense. And so the idea is I see an interesting natural phenomenon and I want to study that. And so then I design experiments to try to how to figure that out. But I'm figuring out just to figure out what the heck's going on with these ants. So these ants seem to move their nests once every week. Why do they do that? Okay, let's find out. Let's run some experiments. These ants are more heat tolerant in the daytime than they are in the evening. Well, how does a colony manage that? Well, let's do some experiments and find out. And so every single time I ask one of these questions, then I have to learn a whole new set of things. So the ants that I'm working with now, this heat tolerant situation, there's a project that I was working on with some students. It was like a one-day project. They've discovered that the ants that were foraging in the evening had a lower heat tolerance than the ants that are foraging in the day, which is no shock. If it's hotter out, then you should be able to withstand more heat. But I was wondering, well, how do they do this? So how do they organize this? How do the ants know that they need to actually be more tolerant of heat in the daytime than the nighttime? Do they have some kind of circadian rhythm? Ultimately, this is a physiological process where you produce heat shock proteins to be able to withstand heat. Does that mean they're making more heat shock proteins in the daytime? Or some colonies are more heat tolerant than other colonies? They forage different times of day? Or do they have specialized foragers that go out when it's hot and other specialized foragers that go out when it's cold? And so I would design a whole bunch of experiments to tease these out. But to understand all this, that means I need to understand the physiology of heat tolerance. I need to understand how climate change affects how organisms express heat shock proteins. And so I didn't train as a physiological ecologist, so there's a whole lot to learn there just to do this one paper on thermal tolerance in ants.
Huh.
So there's a lot more ants than just ants.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the reason I started working with ants isn't just because they're ants, because they're in a useful and important model system, because they are ubiquitous and because they feed from all these different trophic levels and they have all kinds of ecological interactions. Then by studying ants, they can be indicators for all kinds of other stuff, but also useful for answering all kinds of questions. So when I was starting to work on ants, I was looking at invasive species, the ones that were introduced from one part of the world into other parts of the world, which cause both ecological havoc, but also cause a lot of economic damage because invasive species just create things that need to be controlled. For example, the effects of like red imported fire ants in the southeastern U.S. It's expensive to manage them.
Sure.
And so by studying ants, we can learn more broad lessons about invasive species, for example.
And that's where you mentioned the model species or the model systems piece of it there, because we've heard that on the show before. We've heard scientists talk about that, and sometimes that's hard to get your head wrapped around as a student to think, why study something because it's a model system? But as you're mentioning there, you learn a lot more from it that you can apply elsewhere.
Yeah, I think the reason that model systems are useful is that there are some organisms that are more suitable for answering questions because it's easier to collect the data on. So, for example, I'm interested in studying what affects the growth rate of organisms or how much they reproduce. And so you can crack open an ant colony and get an instantaneous measure of how much they're reproducing because you'll have all the baby ants, the larvae and the pupae, all the brood collectively. To do that kind of thing with birds would take a whole career, right? You have to follow the birds around, find their nest, get a camera, watch the nest, wait for a whole season to count how many eggs they lay. But ant
flying
colonies,
dinosaurs.
you can just break open the twig.
Flying dinosaurs, though, I mean, my cats are fascinated.
But they are
by
cool.
them.
They're flying. That's kind of awesome to study dinosaurs. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but you had me at ants there. I'm intrigued a little bit
Did you just
more.
say you had me at ants?
You had me at ants.
Do you find yourself like, what's travel like? Do you mentioned the rainforest? How frequently do you have to travel? COVID aside.
Well, lately with the whole COVID. Oh gosh, this is the longest I've been away from Costa Rica, where my field site is in Central America, since 1995. I usually go down once or twice a year, cumulatively for maybe 2 to 4 weeks, because I have, like spouse and family and obligations at home. And so I will, depending upon my funding, then I'll have a certain number of people or technicians working on projects while I'm not there. I have an office down at a field station, and it's like a place where people come from all over the world to study organisms together. It's kind of a magical place, the Selva Biological Station. And so I will go down there and can ramp up and do projects right away and come home. And so it's only like a couple hours from the airport to get to the field station, which isn't so bad.
So that's a trip a year?
1 to 3 trips a year, depending on what's going on. And so if I'm ramping down, then I'll go in May for a couple weeks. But if things are more active or if I'm being involved in something else, then it might be a bit longer. Or
but for the most part, the same location too, right?
Right. Yeah, there's this one forest that I've been working in for a very long time. And so what's really handy is I can identify all the ants there pretty easily. I know exactly where I'm going to go, but also I have all my stuff in storage. I have my thermocycler stored in the closet. I have all my ant sampling, everything else. So it's like I can just show up and work.
He has a thermocycler in his closet down in storage in Central America. This is not something we used to hear about back in the 90s. Like that was that's a big deal.
Yeah.
So you do a lot of research down there, of course, but you must bring samples back. And how do you get ants back into the United States? I know you said they're tiny, but
tiny little passports.
There still must be issues in transporting wildlife like that.
Yeah, well, you get permits. So it turns out it's an interesting happenstance with U.S. law that insects are not animals.
Oh.
So when they say, do you have animals?
I feel like we failed already in the science education.
Yes, so it's a loophole we're exploiting, so we'll keep it for that.
So there are some insects that are CITES protected, like, pretty butterflies that are endangered that people collect. So CITES, I mean, if it's an endangered species and there's international trade, it's prohibited. And so But as far as I know, there are no CITES protected ants or anything like that. And so, at least not the ones I work with.
What are you calling it? CITES?
CITES protected, the International Treaty for Endangered Species.
Oh, okay.
And so, for example, if you work on poison frogs, or you work on bird-winged butterflies, or if you work on elephants or African rhinos, then any kind of research needs a CITES permit, which is like an international level kind of thing. But otherwise, in the United States, if I'm bringing back dead animals, because I basically bring back animals in vials, then what they're concerned about is that I wasn't breaking Costa Rican law. So I need to get a research permit from Costa Rica, and then if I'm collecting, a collecting permit, and if I want to take them out of the country, an export permit, and if I'm going to be doing something involving DNA or genomic work, then I need a separate permit to collect the biological integrity and knowledge of Costa Rica.
Convention
and so getting permits getting harder.
Okay, it's getting harder.
Yeah, I mean, for internal reasons and politics and who's in charge of what.
Sure.
But if you're not working with if you're not doing genomic work, then it should take 1 or 2 months. And there are people that can help process the paperwork if you don't have the time. Like a lot of grad students I know who have more time than money potentially. That's not to say their time isn't valuable. They just don't have the money.
That makes sense.
then they will spend a couple days in Costa Rica waiting to process paperwork. Whereas there's other organizations that I work with that they'll actually have someone help process the paperwork for you because you don't have the time to wait for the office to open.
Okay.
Oh, wow. So during the pandemic, has that helped or hurt conservation efforts down where you do your studies?
That's hard to say because I literally haven't been down there, so I don't know. So the field station that I work at has come upon hard financial times because people aren't visiting the station because of travel issues. And so that's probably not good for protecting the land that they're on and to hire people to protect it and whatnot. I don't know about the Costa Rican National Park system and all that, how they're handling all this. In theory, you would expect if people aren't traveling around much, then maybe that would be better for protection. But then again, people will still do illegal hunting for subsistence, to sell meat and potentially.
It's a question that I've been thinking about a lot with just changes during the pandemic and how has this affected what we have normally done or what we haven't done, and obviously we think about how things have changed and how they haven't, and now we're coming on a year for the pandemic, and what has changed, what hasn't, and how has that affected science? Has the pandemic affected anything else in terms of how you do your work and the scientific process at your university, for instance, or anything else like that?
So my university has shut down almost all in-person science and teaching, and so we've gone almost entirely remote just for safety reasons. I mean, we're in Los Angeles, which is, as a large city, is having a lot of issues and concerns about safety for COVID. So it honestly hasn't slowed down productivity in my lab per se, because I have so many years of data from projects that I've been wanting to publish. I haven't had the time to. That said, I haven't had the bandwidth to get all of them, I guess. But it's not as if I'm like needing desperately to rush out and collect new data, because I do have this old backlog. The challenging part is I can't work with students in the laboratory. And so I am working with one student who I'm training into my lab this semester. And we basically remotely via Zoom once a week, which is not exactly the best, especially if you're trying to teach coding and trying to do all the sophisticated statistical analyses that we need to do on the data and manage and manipulate the data. Then that's manipulate the data in a sensible, good way to get it to do what we need it to do. Just the data you need. And so that's been a real challenge.
Before we let you go, Terry, talk to us about your university a little bit more. What's it like, and are there things that you're working on specifically there that are maybe within the lab or outside of the lab, or what else is going on?
Yeah. So I'm at Cal State Dominguez Hills. And one thing I love about it is that it looks like Los Angeles, or it looks like California, is that it really represents the kind of people that we have just living in LA. And so 70% of the students or so are first generation students. I'm the director of undergraduate research at Cal State Dominguez Hills. And so actually have been doing much teaching lately because I've been reassigned to help do this work to get students to have more research opportunities and support them to get into graduate school. And so the mission of our institution is to focus on providing opportunities to those who might have had prior opportunities. And so it's work that's important to me.
Oh, wow. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time there, Terry. It's been a fascinating conversation and made us think a little bit more about ants in a different light. And maybe for some ants, they actually think about light differently, too.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Lab Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about some of the things discussed in this episode or previous episodes, you can find show notes at our website, laboutloud.com. If you have a guest idea or a future topic that you'd like to see on Lab Out Loud, go to our contact page and send us a message. Also, you can subscribe to Lab Out Loud on your favorite podcasting app, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to find podcasts. While you're there, leave us a review and rating. Your input helps others find our show. Thanks again for listening.